Hey everybody, happy Tuesday and welcome into another episode of Rethink Reshoring. My name is Kaylee Nix and I'm here with Rosemary Coates from the Reshoring Institute. Today we're talking about some hidden dangers of working with Chinese suppliers and why that might be one of those big reasons people are deciding to reshore their operations. Rosemary, thanks for joining us as always. How are you doing on this Tuesday?
Good. I understand it's really hot there in Chattanooga.
It's been pretty warm, and you guys out in Silicon Valley are turning up the heat a little bit as well. But you know what? I would take high 80s over mid 90s any day.
Yeah, we've had a very mild summer.
That's
Yes.
good. It's good. It's been hot here. Let's dig into the topic of today because we have a pretty interesting one, as always. Chinese suppliers. And of course, we've talked about the risks and the pitfalls of your supply chain being one of those major reasons for reshoring. Today, we're doing a little bit of a zoom in on China specifically. We know that in the last kind of 10 to 12 months, the Chinese economy has had a really tough time getting back on its feet. Has this been a really big cause for concern for a lot of folks and maybe a big drive in some of that reshoring that we've been seeing?
Yes. Well, as you know, the risks of long global supply chains were really exposed during the pandemic for sure. And I think it's important that we keep an eye on those kind of risks also. The Chinese economy has been struggling over the last year or two. It used to be, for a couple of decades, China was growing at double digit growth, 13, 14, 15%. I mean, it was just amazingly high growth rates. And that's really difficult to maintain, but also an amazing miracle of Chinese industrialization. But last year, the economy in China only grew 6%. So there were some warning signs there. They just published some new statistics that say that China only grew 2% in the past year. And that is a huge red flag. So, in terms of the struggles, when the economy isn't doing well, businesses aren't doing well either. And so that includes Chinese suppliers who are struggling to maintain their client base and, funding from the government and so forth. So it's become a real issue and a big red flag and a lot of risk that's been introduced.
So, of course, China was the first country to shut down with the COVID-19 pandemic, and they were also the last country to escape pretty much the entire broad umbrella of those restrictions. In some places, there might even still be some long-lasting effects and restrictions still in place across China. And obviously, that was very, very damaging to their economy because they had a zero tolerance policy for a while. When we compare that to what we saw here in the United States, obviously, we saw some strict measures be put in place, but for a lot of us, the factory workers, producers, people that were on these assembly lines were considered essential workers. They were still allowed to go to their jobs. They were still able to operate and produce even if there was some COVID restriction in place. And that wasn't the case in China. How terribly did that and the strictness of the Chinese government policies really impact its economy, and how now long has that lasted into the ripple effects that we've seen today?
Yeah, that's a really important component of it. Certainly, the Chinese government policy for zero tolerance made factories open and close and open and close, and this was a terribly damaging effect on global supply chains for sure. But the other half of that too is that the Chinese vaccines were not as effective as those that we were producing and giving in the U.S. So it took them quite a bit longer to actually recover and to make sure everyone was vaccinated. And even then, there's still outbreaks of COVID that are happening across China. So there was a lot of issues with respect to the government and also how they pursued the policies to control COVID versus the US, which we seem to recover pretty fast. I mean, once vaccines were given widely across the US, we were able to reopen factories. There wasn't so much danger. People weren't scared to death to go outside, to go to any meeting place. I mean, these things really helped us recover very quickly and probably protected us from a recession that was predicted over and over again. It doesn't seem to be ever happening. So yeah, all these things have a big effect on the Chinese environment and certainly did a lot of damage to their economy.
So, the economic effects, as we know, are long lasting and pretty far reaching, especially when we look at globalization. But for those suppliers in China themselves, how are they suffering now and continuing to suffer as we see these detrimental effects of the economy? Is it now less workforce? Is it higher labor costs? Is it higher input costs? Or is it just playing catch up with a lot of the orders and a lot of the things that were made during the times when they happened to be shut down?
Yeah, I think so. If you look at it this way, I mean, an awful lot of companies worldwide that uncovered risk in their global supply chains during the pandemic, all of a sudden, we weren't concerned so much with risk. We knew it was there, but we weren't so concerned with it. But once the pandemic exposed that kind of risk with these very long global supply chains, a lot of companies started rethinking their global manufacturing strategy. And of course, that means benefiting reshoring. We're happy about that at the Reshoring Institute. But companies are rethinking those supply chains and moving some of their sourcing and production out of China to either other low cost countries or to the U.S. back to the U.S., which is our favorite strategy, of course. But in the meantime, in the wake of that, as they're taking business away from Chinese suppliers, those Chinese suppliers start to really struggle. And so what we're seeing now are an awful lot of bankruptcies across China. And the thing is, it's not like in the U.S. where you go to bankruptcy court, you file, and there's a procedure, and you maybe pay your suppliers 10% of what they're due, all that. There is not that formality in China. Very often, what you find is a supplier will simply close up shop and skip town, or close up shop altogether and just not continue to do business. And as you can imagine, this can be a real problem if you've got an order on the books at one of these suppliers, or they're half-made goods on that production line, and the supplier shuts down. You're really out of luck. I mean, this is can be a major headache, a major problem for buyers who are sourcing products worldwide, and particularly in China.
So obviously this affects the suppliers themselves from a corporate level, but I want to maybe ask you a little bit about the individuals and the individual workers who are affected by this as well. If a Chinese supplier goes out of business, are there any types of worker protections in place, or is there a very big disparity between what happens to the supplier and what happens to the individual employee, the Chinese citizens, if they necessarily don't have a job anymore? When this happens in the US, we have some of those worker protections. We of course have laws that necessitate several days or months worth of notice before you would lose a job. Does that same kind of thing happen in China, or are a lot of these individuals who rely on factory and supplier work for their jobs just kind of out of luck?
Yeah, so there's some of that. I mean, there are some laws on the books in China that help individuals that are unemployed, but it's really minimal and it's unevenly applied. So it may be applied to certain companies and not others. So this is a real problem. So yeah, those Chinese workers are just out of luck. It used to be when the economy was booming in China, it was no problem if a factory shut down. You just went to the next factory next door. There were lots of jobs available. It was a growth economy. It was sort of a feeding frenzy. Wherever you wanted to go and work, you pretty much could. Whether it was coming from a coast or somewhere else, and or from inland to the coast or somewhere else, you were able to find jobs. Not so in this environment. In fact, one of the biggest issues is college graduates in China who can't find a job, whether that's in a factory or a white collar job in a high rise building. Those jobs are just not materializing, and so this is going to have a fairly significant effect across the board on the Chinese economy. Uh, so yeah, I mean it's a downward spiral. There's a lot of rumbling of what they would call deflation in China, which means that prices are going to be reduced, just as we're experiencing inflation in the U.S. Deflation has the opposite effect. People don't have jobs, prices are going down. There's a glut of goods on the economy for sale. These are bad economic problems to deal with.
That's a really interesting point that you raised about college educated graduates not being able to find either a white collar job or a job in a factory, because oftentimes
Right.
it's the opposite way here in the United States, right? We think of folks who go to college to find that white collar job, then we see the shortage of factory workers or those blue collar jobs because people are choosing a collegiate education instead. Why does that kind of situation exist in China, where folks who might have that college education still have the opportunity or make the choice to go work a physical labor job in a factory or a supplier?
Yeah, well, a lot of people just graduate from college and they don't want to work in a factory, and so they would rather just stay unemployed and try to do something else. So it's a trend. It's a real problem with oversupply of college educated workers who are millennials, and they don't necessarily want to go to work, and so they're just unemployed and living with their parents probably. These are common issues in China with the workers there. So it's got a ripple effect around the world as well. So it's not just the Chinese economy that's going to suffer. As we see these bankruptcies and lack of growth in China, our economies are intertwined. It's going to affect worldwide. What happens with economies everywhere.
So I think, of course, it's super interesting when you juxtapose it with the US. So thank you for answering that question. Let's move on to, for these companies who are maybe starting to look at possibly working with a Chinese supplier, how they know if the supplier is in good health or not, because that can be a pretty big risk, especially if you're trying to decide whether you work closer to home or take things across the Pacific. What are some of those key indicators that a company should look for if they're starting to work with a new
Yeah.
supplier that tells them if they're healthy or maybe not?
Yeah, so this is another big issue because there isn't much transparency in dealing with suppliers in China. So if you were putting a new contract out there for a supplier, it behooves you to do your due diligence as best as you can. So to find out if this supplier is legitimate, if they're up and running, if they're producing products on a regular basis, if overall the factory looks healthy, if it's busy, that sort of thing. And then you would also want to check references, for example. You would want to understand if they had payment problems in the past and so forth. Well, there are some warning signs when you find a supplier, or you might be dealing with a supplier that may be having some kind of financial trouble, or maybe they've lost a big contract and they're struggling to have working capital, or there's all kinds of issues that may go on in this kind of environment where there is this slowdown in the Chinese economy. So how do we tell if a supplier is struggling? Boy, there are some things that happen that may cause you to be suspicious. So, for example, if you've been dealing with supplier for a long time, and all of a sudden they ask for additional down payment on new production. So, used to be you might put 30% down so that they could buy raw materials to produce your product, and now they're asking for 50 or 60% down, and then give you some excuse why that should happen or why that's important. If they are demanding payment faster than usual, so if, for example, your contract says you'll pay 30 days after arrival in the US, and they try to negotiate that back down to you pay on the day they ship from China. So tightening, and those are indicators that they're having financial problems. Um, Sometimes that means the people you're dealing with in the factory, you can't get a hold of them. They seem to be gone, or they're just not available to you. That's another flag. And I've mentioned this again and again. You need to be feet on the street in China. You need to go there and look at the factories and validate for yourself what's happening. And if that's not possible because there are travel restrictions or whatever, you need to hire somebody to go do that on your behalf. So it's really important that you oversee what's going on. So those warning signs, are important flags. They should tell you there's something going on. And, the poor purchasing people in the US that are part of an organization, you're trying to procure goods, you're trying to find global suppliers, and now you have to worry about all this financial stuff too. But that's the reality today, and it should be incorporated in part of your job in sourcing and manufacturing overseas.
Visibility and realistic visibility, of course, things that are very important. I can't help but think of it like we need almost like a crowdsourced review app, like a Yelp, but for Chinese suppliers,
Yeah.
right? Is that an opportunity for technology to maybe swoop in and for someone to develop a platform like that where maybe manufacturers, well, I guess it's kind of hard because some manufacturers don't like to devise or delve with who they work with, right? They want to keep that close to the cuff. But do you think that that's maybe an opportunity for a platform to be created to give a little bit more visibility into the quality of suppliers and make people make more informed decisions?
Yes and no. I mean, there's so much manipulation of what goes on in China that's really hard to say whether any of that would be truthful. So there are already sourcing platforms. Global Sources, for example, is a big platform where you can find various suppliers. Alibaba is another one where you can go there and put in, what it is you're looking for. If you're looking for making plastic toys, for example, or some machine part, you can go in and put that into the search engine in either one of those sources, and come up with suppliers in China, various suppliers in China. And they're often rated also. So they might have a 5-star rating or whatever. But what you don't know is how did they come up with that 5-star rating? Did they pay extra for it? Did they, have their relatives all go on and rate them at 5 stars? Or, there's a lot of manipulation that's involved. And the same would be true if you had a Yelp or a, other kind of app that might review certain places. And in fact, I think there are some of those kind of things for restaurants in China. But once again, you don't know how it's being manipulated or if it's really truthful. So limited access, limited success with stuff like that.
That manipulation factor is a really good segue into my next question. And another risk, I think, of working with Chinese suppliers is the fact that there's always a lot of geopolitical strain and a lot of scrutiny going on around the Chinese government, right? We've seen two
Yes.
separate administrations here in the United States in just the last decade that have two very different approaches to how they deal with China, whether that's from a tariff standpoint or from a restriction on goods imported from China standpoint. And that can cause a lot of headaches, especially if you're a manufacturer who signs an extended contract or has this extended expectation, right? Can you touch on those geopolitical differences and how that can also be a risk if you're looking to maybe extend your manufacturing life with a foreign supplier?
Yeah, the geopolitical aspect to what's going on here is really important and raised its ugly head during the pandemic and shortly thereafter, and certainly during the trade wars that were introduced by the Trump administration. All of a sudden, how the government feels about manufacturing in their country and whether or not they want to continue on to work with U.S. customers or not. These are all things that you have to take into consideration. Also, the Chinese government is very protective of certain industries. So, for example, their artificial intelligence development is very protected by the government. Excuse me. And so, if you're in that industry, you're going to be competing not only against commercial enterprises, but what the government thinks is important. So, those geopolitical things are really important. And right now, our relationship with China is very bad. It was pretty good in the early 2000s, where we were taking advantage of this really cheap environment to manufacture goods. And that was the way the US viewed the development of democracy worldwide. So, we help our these countries and they become our partners so that we can help develop their economies and put people to work. And then everybody wins. They're partners with the US. They keep their people employed and they don't migrate to the US. And, there are all kinds of good reasons for investing in companies in countries worldwide. And the same was true in China. I mean, we helped them We opened the doors via the World Trade Association. They developed, this fantastic industrial environment. We took advantage of low cost sourcing there for 25 years. And then they became a superpower, and now all of a sudden the genie is out of the bottle, and now how do we get it back in the bottle, or how do we apply restrictions that are going to help us coexist in a friendlier kind of global atmosphere. So there's a lot of work to be done with respect to geopolitics. Right now, the U.S. and China are at odds on a lot of things. It's kind of an unfavorable environment. There may be restrictions on what you can and can't manufacture in the Chinese environment. The U.S. government is restricting exports of certain things. So, all these things are going to contribute to your global view, what you can source in China, what you can sell to China. These are things to watch. And, once again, I know my procurement colleagues are all busy heads down buying stuff for their companies. But the bigger picture with respect to the global environment is also very important to watch, so that you can identify risks ahead of time and take protective action for your own company.
So obviously those geopolitical relationships don't happen in a silo, right? We think about how China has a working relationship with the United States, but they also have a very developed working relationship with countries like Russia, who have their own issues that we could talk about in a later episode. But when we talk
Right.
about this and looking at decision-making processes, how heavily do some of those, I guess, unsiloed relationships weigh, knowing that both a superpower like China can have this relationship with the U.S., but also turn around and have a working relationship of kind of a different kind with a country who has a very different stance on a lot of things?
Yeah, a very different stance. I mean, with Russia, for example, yeah, I mean, obviously, we don't want to help Russia at this point. And if China is supplying weaponry, which they're not at this point, as far as we know, but if they decide to do that, and that shifts the geopolitics again and makes it even more difficult for the U.S. and U.S. manufacturers to source from China. So practically speaking, when you're actually trying to do business in China, you're either manufacturing there or you are finding suppliers there. That's going to shift your perspective and your view. The other thing that I think is fairly important is when I talk to colleagues in Europe, they're not so concerned about China. So, we sort of took a strong stance and said, they're stealing jobs, and, we should bring manufacturing back home. And, we have a lot of rhetoric in the US that is unfavorable towards China at this particular point. But that's not so much the case in Europe, where they're also interdependent in terms of their economies on sourcing and manufacturing in China. I mean, you take Germany, for example, they have lots of automotive plants and auto parts makers that are sourced from China. There is, all sorts of heavy equipment that is manufactured in China and then imported throughout Europe, whether it's the UK or France or Spain or Germany. So, these kind of relationships are different, and we have to remember that we look through the lens of the US. And when we do that, we can understand how it affects us individually here in the US, but we also need to keep in mind that the global environment is somewhat different, and how we act and interact with those global players is dependent on a lot on those relationships.
Sometimes I think that lens of the U.S. involves very often the thought that we are separated from everybody else by two very distinct bodies of water, whereas Europe
Right.
doesn't necessarily have that luxury from being completely cut
Right.
off from places like China and Russia. Another very, very interesting topic for us today, Rosemary. I love this zoom in a little bit specifically on China and the Chinese economy. Let's talk a little bit about last week's episode, because it was a good one. I didn't get a chance to join you guys, but give us a quick little synopsis about your episode from last week.
Yeah, so we were talking to a gentleman from Colliers, and he was telling us that the real estate market is very much in flux, and that there's a lot of emphasis being placed on developing real estate along the border. So what's happening is suppliers are migrating into Mexico because they have a high labor content, or they're looking for a low cost environment. So instead of choosing the U.S., they're taking an interim step and choosing Mexico, and that has an effect on the real commercial real estate all throughout the South, and particularly along the border. So that was a really interesting episode to understand the economics of commercial real estate development as well.
And if you missed that episode, you can head on over to our FreightWaves YouTube channel, youtube.com/FreightWaves. It's easy to find and check that out. Thank you for joining us today for Rethink Reshoring. Thank you all for staying tuned in with us through today and through these last few weeks. We'll catch you guys next Tuesday, and have a great rest of your week.